One of the most nuanced things in TF2 are ubercharges. As you all know, Ubers are... Do I even need to say what kind of mechanic it is? Sound off in the comments if you know what I was going to say there. But yeah, Ubers are extremely nuanced. In other games similar to TF2 in sort of style and flavor, every character has some form of ultimate ability. Not really the case in TF2. Ubers are really the only thing that resembles that kind of power. And as a result, there's a lot of decision making that goes into how to play Ubers, how to play against Ubers in a way that makes it a very centralizing mechanic. I couldn't resist. So yeah, I want to talk about a very specific interaction, I'll say, which if any of you are roamer players, maybe you'll have this unfortunate experience where your team does a lot of pressure, things are mounting up, what's the word I'm looking for? The other team is having a tough time. Eventually you're able to sack in, get that force, and oh wait, your own med was a little too committed, and now your own med has to use, and you're dead because you sacked, and suddenly your team is just down one in the exchange, and you can't do anything in the post. And all that effort was for nothing. And there are going to be similar situations in which maybe you get the force, and it looks like your team wants to just take an Uber, not getting forced, but you want to be proactively taking an Uber because you think it'll go well for you. How are these situations different? In what kind of scenarios in these sort of even Ubers, exchangey kind of territories do you want to be committing your Uber? And at what point would you rather be backing up and playing the Uber advantage and re-pushing with that ad for an Uber advantage push? So yeah, that's going to be the focus of today. For starters, let us establish, I'll just clarify specifically what kind of situations I'm talking about, even though I kind of just did a decent enough job. But again, those exchangey sort of zones where it is even Ubers, but a med gets forced while there's maybe some hard pressure going on and you're tasked with the decision of whether to use yourself or not. And in some cases as well, I've talked in the past about dropping players intentionally, such as dropping a demo in order to preserve ad, and how that can oftentimes be worthwhile. These types of situations are encompassed in that as well. And in fact, we're kind of seeing something similar here where we use and we get enough kills that the other med is kind of committed and they just have to use anyway. So if that med was able to recognize the writing on the wall and save their demo, then they would be in a much better situation overall. They unfortunately still hold, but still. Right. Okay. So when do you actually commit your Uber to these types of situations or not? Assuming that you're like getting the force first and you have the choice of whether or not to use. There's quite a simple answer, which I'll go over a lot of examples of. But the simple answer is that you should use if you think the post is going to be better if you use, and you shouldn't if you think that the eventual post from your Uber will be better if you don't use. I know that's extremely obvious almost, or self-explanatory, but I'll provide some examples. For starters, let's imagine that let's do an easy example. Let's say you 4-man sack into last. So a 4-man sack, the reason you might go for something like that is it's a very drastic sacking option. You're losing the majority of your team. You're only going to have a combat player and your medic alive at the end of things. But because you're sacking so many players, you're absolutely going to overwhelm the defense. Unless their demo gets like multiple trap kills, in all likelihood, you're going to have at least a decent attempt on the medic's life, which is a very high chance to get the force, right? However, by losing so many combat players, you're almost certainly going to be having to leave the point you're currently on, which is usually second. A 4-man sack is something you usually do until last on a stalemate. So you're sacking all these players for a really high chance of getting the force, and you're almost always going to have to leave the point you're currently on because, again, you're just losing so many combat players. Now, let's say you do get the force. Is this a situation in which you should commit your Uber or not? In basically every circumstance, no. And the reasons being that the post-Uber you're expecting from that type of situation is, sure, maybe it's usually going to be a Pocket Scout surviving. Usually your Pocket Scout and your Medic, they could play close, and they could pop Uber on the players that are starting to push out, and they're probably going to push out pretty quickly and pretty carelessly because of, them having 4-player advantage. So they're not going to expect you to be close and not going to expect you to take that Uber. So as a result, your Scout can maybe get 1 or 2 kills. Maybe your Scout can even get the Medic. But again, you are at a 4-player deficit, so that Scout would need to get 4 kills with the Uber, which is just not going to happen. And you're expecting your post-Uber to be, you get maybe a couple kills, maybe you even kill the other med. Great. But your own Scout and your own Med are absolutely going to be caught in the post. You're losing your Scout and your Medic in that post-Uber. The best case scenario where you kill their Medic, you're still probably going to be even Ubers when all is said and done. Versus the alternative of not using and leaving, you have, sure, you lose second because you're down 2, you back up. And maybe, let's say, like, worst case scenario, a couple of your spawners get denied. So the other team caps second before they spawn, meaning rather than spawning on the mid-forward spawn, like I'm standing next to right now, they spawn on the second point forward spawn, which has a little bit of a rollout associated. And the other team tries to pressure into mid off of those denies. That's like worst case scenario, right? Assuming you got the force, because you could just not get the force still. Anyway, with that being the situation, you're still tasked with an Uber ad on mid waiting for your spawners to roll out, which is much better, I would say, than even Ubers on mid, right? Sure, the other team might have some space through the doors, but you can take an Uber that gets some kills and transition that into second, which would in all likelihood kind of even things out on second, so kind of reset things to the initial situation before the 4-man. Or you can successfully hold mid and dry push second for that same kind of even Ubers. Or if you're really quick and the other team leaves particularly early on mid, then you might still have add into last for fast transition for a potential Uber into last. But point being, these are all definitely like favorable situations to even Ubers on mid. So, right. Like, I understand that it sounds very complicated, and obviously you're gonna need to kind of be able to suss out or figure out what type of expected situations you're going to be dealing with based on the state of Ubers and whatnot. But when you run through the kind of reasoning there, it does boil down to one of these post Ubers is more favorable than the other. So that's probably why we shouldn't be committing our Uber here. Let me think of another, I'll say closer example. So, there are situations in which, what should my next example be, actually? Let's think. Oh, there we go, feeding. Unlucky. Let's give another example of when committing Uber can be kind of bad. And this is something that I actually saw in a friend's shadow play yesterday, where he rolled out heavy into last on even Ubers. And just kind of waddled, this was on process, just kind of waddled through one into last, got a kill on a player, and got the force, but his own med commit and used Uber to save a bunch of players, and they all commit to a fight. They end up winning the round anyway, but the calm that the heavy makes during that, which is a bit of a unhelpful and toxic calm, but like, whatever. It was, oh, why did you use? Which expresses a very clear idea there of, I think it was better if you just preserved the ad. Because you are tasked with a situation in which, yes, you have a kill. Yes, the other team used. If you commit your Uber, you're looking at a post Uber with a pick, right? Which is pretty nice, don't get me wrong. And post Uber with a pick and a heavy, which is quite nice. Like heavy's a great class to have already through a door in a post Uber situation. But nonetheless, depending on how comfortable your team is at pushing with Uber advantages, you might rather have an ad push into last. Because a team is not going to push out of last on disad down a guy. So you're going to have two or second no matter what, right? And if you preserve that Uber advantage, then you will be able to push into last with it, right? And yeah, so with that kind of thing, it's a little more iffy and a little more subjective, but it really does come down to how, well, we'll talk about some of the factors in a moment, but from that player's perspective, they thought they had better odds of scoring a round, or they thought they had a better post Uber from an ad push into last compared to the one kill with the heavy in like the post exchange, basically, where I suppose his Uber lasted a little bit longer, but not really so much longer that it makes a meaningful difference. It is more exchangey kind of territory. And yeah, there are factors to consider here. So the factors to consider are going to be your own team's strengths and weaknesses. Some examples include, like I mentioned, how good you are at pushing with Uber advantage or pushing into last, things like that. If your team is particularly strong at pushing into last with ad, then you're going to be more inclined to save those Ubers and just push into last with the ad later on. Or if your team is particularly bad at dry pushing, you might be more inclined to take that Uber and actually use it. Because a lot of the time in those scenarios where you're tasked with using or not, you're often giving something up to preserve the Uber advantage, such as picks or something like that. And usually you give up space as a result. So that space you have to be able to retake without using your Uber to have that extra Uber advantage on top of things, if that makes sense. Because if you use your Uber to just regain the space you got, then you're kind of back at square one. Whereas if you can successfully take that just with the ad without having to use the ad, then you will oftentimes still have Uber ad into the next point for a stronger advantage than you started out with. So that being said, the strength of your pushes versus the strength of your Uber pushes versus your dry pushes are something to consider, and how successful you think you'll be at converting those. On top of how comfortable you are in those exchange type of scenarios and how comfortable your team is during Uber exchanges and post exchange fights. Because some teams are much better at post exchange fights than others. A lot of it does come down to people just kind of preparing for the post, getting ready. And I'm saying post a lot. For the record, when I say post, I'm referring to the fight that occurs after the Ubers end, because that's usually the important part. Yeah, like you can see here, it didn't matter that med was Ubered. What mattered was what the med was doing when they weren't Ubered. Because if that med made it through that door and into lobby before the Uber faded, then that would have been a relatively even exchange. I mean, obviously we're getting the point. They have to leave, so it's like still favorable for us, but it's not as catastrophically bad as it is now. Okay, never mind. My med got headshot, so it's totally fine for them. But you get the point. It's about what happens when the Uber ends rather than, what happens during the Uber. Sometimes you can get kills during the Uber, stuff like that. Again, Ubers are just so nuanced, especially exchanges. There's just so many things going on. But I'm trying to break it down into basic terms. So, yeah, all that to say, when I'm referring to post in the context of this video, it is post Uber. What happens after the Uber, because that's usually like the important stuff. Anyway, damn, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, just post-exchange scenarios in general, how to play them. Because again, a lot of the time, your success in a post-Uber exchange is going to be marked by your ability to, well, your team's ability and the players on it, their ability to stay healthy during the exchange itself, not take unnecessary fights, and play in such a way that They are just set up to take the post-Uber fight as strongly as possible, rather than just take stupid fights during the exchange, waste all their health. Sometimes you get a kill, but a lot of the time it's just a coin flip 1v1. And if they die, then you just lose the post-Uber fight. And depending on how committed you are to the point, you might just have to leave. So yeah, having those healthy players for the post, definitely quite nice. But that's a factor, how good your team is at playing the post-Uber exchanges. And if you're particularly strong at that, then you might be more inclined to play the exchange side of things, or use the Uber after getting that force when things might be favorable. Of course, if you're down a bunch of guys, well, I suppose that's the next factor. The other factor is, of course, just kind of the game state in general. And this is more divorced from the subjectivity of how good your team is at a particular aspect of the game or not. There are just some game states that are going to be more favorable or less favorable for you. One such example, if you commit both soldiers and get the force, should you be staying in lobby and trying to use in on the team pushing out? A lot of the time, not really. And there are times that I've seen like invite teams mess this up, where they commit a lot of resources to getting the force. It's like, okay, great, you did it. You broke the stalemate. But then they just stay aggressive and get forced and take an Uber that's not even like good. And then things kind of just reset, as opposed to you maybe back up a little bit, have your guys show up after spawning, you retake that space with the Uber advantage, and successfully dry push it without committing your Uber. And then you have the add into last, right? So things like the game state in general, the number of kills you have, your positioning, stuff like that, all matters a lot as well. And another factor to consider is whether you even have a choice or not. And what I mean by this is, and this is more of a medic thing, but obviously it's something that everyone can kind of understand and notice. But there are occasions where you are just going to have to use, because yes, you can try and drop players and leave and do all sorts of things, but you are you're going to get forced regardless. So it does not matter. You may as well save players if you're going to get forced anyway. Some such examples being like, I guess the easiest example to understand is if a medic is leaving with their scout, and their scout is going to die, this med knows that, well, if the scout dies, this is the only guy who can defend me. I'm going to die to whoever kills my scout. So I need to save my scout. Otherwise, I'm going to have to use anyway. And since I have to use anyway, I may as well save a player, right? Situations like that, where the other team uses and you understand that you're going to get forced anyway, unless you save players. And obviously you can't save the players unless you use, so you kind of have to use regardless. But point being, you're using it in a more proactive manner that sets your team up for a better post than if you just got forced anyway. Because again, if you're able to at least save some players, then maybe it's kind of just like a reset of the situation. Things are overall neutral when all is said and done, because you like saved everyone, just took a pretty mediocre exchange, as opposed to you lose a bunch of people, get forced anyway, and now you have to leave, and it's obviously like favored for the other team rather than overall neutral. So again, still a favorable post, still something to consider, but you kind of have to think about, again, whether you have that choice or not. Right. Any other specific examples? What about some where committing Uber is maybe a good idea? And this does come down a lot to your team's comfortability with those post-Uber exchange fights. Because, yeah, it's going to be a very fluid kind of fight, a very dynamic situation. And if you're more comfortable with that, then your team can overall thrive more in that type of environment. Teams I've played on, I usually like taking ad pushes just because I like the structured ad push. I think I'm generally like a decent communicator as far as pushing into last goes. Teams I've played on have had a solid kind of understanding of the flow of a last push. And yeah, our success rate for that has been proportionately higher than more messy fights. where there's more chaos going on. So as a result, teams I've played on generally prefer not to commit Uber in those kind of sketchy situations in which you might have a choice to or not. But other teams, going to be a different story. And in those cases where you might want to, let's think. What is a good example? Let us say that you're a team that's not that great at pushing last with add. Maybe you've had some unsuccessful pushes. You get the force. And rather than let the other team set up... Oh, here's one. Let's say that your team spams down a gun, kills the engineer, right? So you have a pick, and then your soldier gets the force. Now, in a case like this, there is certainly... that's funny. There is certainly a case to be made for either side of things. Again, depending on those subjectives of how comfortable your team is with these different situations. But you have a kill. You have the gun going down. So already, like, that's one of the main things an Uber would take out. So your post Uber is going to look kind of similar for both. And honestly, getting a kill with an Uber with add into last is generally like a bonus. A lot of the time, an Uber is only expecting to get the gun and positioning if the opponents are playing properly defensively and they aren't caught or anything like that. But a pick is like quite nice. That raises your odds of winning that post drastically. I feel like it's worth mentioning as well that, again, like I keep mentioning how important posts are, but even when it is Uber advantage and the other team doesn't have an Uber, you get to push into their last, try and score a round. It does often come down to the post. Very rarely do you actually win the round during the Uber. It's just the Uber gets enough value, enough space, again, taking out the gun, things like that. It gets enough value to set up a good post where you end up scoring the round afterwards, right? Anyway, what was I talking about? Yeah, the posts are going to look relatively similar, but having that kill, maybe you like just having that guaranteed kill in the post, although I suppose in this situation you're down the soldier, so it would be overall even. So actually scratch that. But I will provide a modified example in a moment. But let's say you're just good at those kind of scrappy post-exchange fights. Your soldiers are good at staying healthy, good at recollapsing, and you just have more confidence in that scenario. You're expecting that post to be better than if you had left and just played Uber add into last and the post associated with that. But one example that would be very clearly preferable is if when that soldier gets the force, you're able to use on them to save them from dying afterwards. In which case, yeah, absolutely, you're setting yourself up for having a kill, being through the doors, because again, your Uber's gonna last longer than theirs, so they're at some point gonna have to respect your space. So you can kind of end your Uber as though it was just an ad Uber, as in picking a side, being able to lock out a spawn on one of the sides. And where's my scout for this Uber? Whatever. It's actually an Uber push going on right now. So take out the gun, finish on the side, and it looks like we are going to have a kill. We do. So lovely Uber. Unfortunately, we lose a player who was kind of out of position there. But now I'm reloaded. Now we're trying to commit across. And they get Uber in time. So it's overall going to be a hold. But yeah, in those times where you might be able to save the player that would be dying and making things more even, if you can save that, then yeah, you're overall going to be a lot better and you might be more inclined to commit your Uber to those types of scenarios. What else? Any other very clear cases of using besides knowing you're going to have to use anyway in those cases? Well, let's talk about like exchanges in general, because a lot of teams, well, in lower levels, teams will just sometimes default to exchanging rather than sacking, which doesn't happen at a higher level, because when you just initiate the exchange as that team pushing into last or pressuring into last, then it almost never goes well for you, just because you're tasked with so many things to do. You'd like to take out the sentry gun, which in this scenario is an even Uber's sentry gun that is more likely to get tanked by an engineer. You would like, well, you kind of need to get the other team to actually use Uber. So you have to divide your attention there. Plus, you have to contend with the spam on the doors. Maybe they have a sniper. Like, no matter what, you're going to have to use first. So your Uber is going to end first. So it's really unlikely you're going to be able to stay in. In all likelihood, you're going to have to leave the point during when the Uber fades. And you're going to have to... you're trying to get enough of an advantage that you can re-push with, which is rare, right? And this is why when you watch an invite game and, you know, they are just sacking slowly, trying to make things happen, and the round timer is running low, so they just take a desperation exchange, it very rarely works, because it's just much easier to play that situation defensively. Right. So as a result, that's not really a plan you see at a higher level of teams just defaulting to play an exchange rather than pressure. But it can work if your team is particularly strong at playing those exchange scenarios, right? To the point where it could be more worthwhile than sacking, if you can set up good post-Uber exchanges. And this kind of it treads in the territory of when to exchange in general rather than in those situations when you get the force, should you also use or try and preserve your ad. Right. Are there any other clear examples where using is good besides when you're gonna need to use anyway, otherwise you're getting forced, or when you think you can set up a favorable... Well, obviously it does all come down to setting up a favorable post, but yeah, that might be it. I feel like there's one that I could cook up, but it is not coming to me at the moment, so I might call things there. Give it like 5 seconds as we watch my team down 3 try and hit a pipe. Okay. Decent damage on the door, but nah, we're going to have to back up. We're actually just caught. We're like still caught. Okay, we use... Oh, we can analyze this from the opponent's perspective. So they're trying to leave. But at this point... Oh, and this could be something worth mentioning. There are situations which you don't have to use, and you're not really turning it into a exchange so much as just add. And this is actually a more common example where teams like to use those Ubers. So, for example, a team will sack 2 into last and get the force, and then they want to immediately take the Uber with the remaining 4 players after the opponent's Uber has faded or long enough that like their Uber is no longer a consideration. And in cases like that, again, it does come down to which post you think will be more favorable because you are down those players. So you are leveraging, or you're deciding between taking a fast Uber that the other team is not set up for, versus taking a more standard Uber with your players, that there's going to be more of a defense set up for, as in they're more likely to have a sentry gun built. They're more likely going to have maybe a defensive sniper in the shutter. They're going to have more players standing further back, less caught to the Uber. So that's what you're weighing, right? To what extent your picks actually matter compared to that. And in the case of losing 2 players, generally I'd say ill-advised. But if you get, for example, a drop, then it might be worthwhile because the fact that the other team doesn't have heals in that post is something that you can leverage to your advantage by just playing that post more slowly, assuming that you get a couple kills with the out-of-position players. So yeah, there are cases like that where you know you're not going to have to use, and you know that you're going to very easily be able to transition into that same ad push into last. But you have the choice of taking an aggressive Uber while down players in order to catch the enemies off guard, and the risk reward associated with that kind of thing as well, which definitely treads in that same territory. And all thanks to what the opponents were doing there, where they didn't have to leave because our Uber wasn't that great, and they were just deciding whether they wanted to use right there with just their scout and demo, or if they wanted to kind of preserve their Uber and just re-push with the ad and presumably dry push. And a big factor there as well is if you can catch the other team's med in those types of situations, because if you can, then it's kind of like a free Uber, because if you can kill a medic and your own med lives, then yeah, it's just going to be like 40 ad if you used Uber. Anyway, I know this was maybe kind of hard to follow because I use a lot of jargon, but hopefully it was still useful. Again, at the end of the day, it really does come down to as simple as, is the post Uber, if we commit our Uber to this, going to be better or worse? Do we expect it to be better or worse than the post Uber if we did the opposite, right? If we actually commit that, if we commit the Uber versus try and bait it and hold on to it and back up and kite the aggression, things like that. And those are going to summarize, depend on your own team's strengths and weaknesses, as well as the actual game state you're expecting to look at or be tasked with in the aftermath. As well as some other factors, which I'm sure I went over but have forgotten since. So anyway, that is all from me. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let's see if... I'm pretty sure this push... No, it's looking like a hold, actually. Very nice. All right. Yeah, it is a hold. Our med lives. Beautiful. Okay, anyway, hope you guys enjoyed, and see you all later.